Single and double pole trekking pole tents are some of the most popular designs among backpackers because of their weight savings ability. Now, they come with some limitations, and my favorite tent is a single pole small pyramid. I use a Locust Gear Kufu, and it's technically a two-person tent, but I like it for one person because I like to store most of my gear inside my tent. The problem with a single pole pyramid is that the pole comes down in the center of the tent and occupies the living space. And so this makes the tent a little bit less livable than a traditional hub and pole or dome style tent where you have the entire living area unobstructed by poles. One way to solve this with trekking pole tents is to use two trekking poles that span the width of the living area. And these are very popular designs. You'll see this in the Z-Pax Duplex and the Tarptent Notch series, the Gossamer Gear, the Two. Those are good examples. Now, the problem with most two-pole trekking pole tents is twofold. Number one, they usually require apex guylines for structure, which means you need at least 4 stakes on the perimeter of the tent and then 2 additional stakes for the apex guylines. And the apex guylines, while providing stability, get in the way of getting in and out of the tent. The other issue with two trekking pole tents is that two trekking poles create a ridge line, and then you've got this expansive span of fabric emanating from that ridge line to the ground surface. And so these relatively steep walls interfere with livability. So if you have 1 or 2 people inside one of these tents, they can sit up in the middle where you have the apex of the tent, but it's difficult to find headroom at either end of the tent because of the sloping sidewalls. And it's also common to have condensation in these tents because many of them are single wall designs. And so your sleeping bag can brush against the ceiling of the tent down at the lower end of these sloping walls and be a source of moisture in your gear. Finally, to save fabric cost and weight, the vestibules on these tents tend to be pretty small. And they are typically smaller than the vestibules you'll find on a dome style tent because a curved pole structure creates a lot of interior volume in the vestibules, and the poles can be offset 1.5 feet or more away from the tent pretty easily without sacrificing any structure at all. And that's difficult to do with a trekking pole tent. One thing I really like about my single pole pyramid is that it is a symmetrically tensioned structure all the way around, so it's incredibly stable. That means in a fabric like Dyneema Composite Fabrics, which has very little stretch to it, it tends to deal with snow loading very well without deformation. In addition, the lack of stretch in the fabric and the overall tension throughout the structure means that it's a very storm-worthy tent and does very well in high winds without flapping. Once you add a second pole to the tent structure, that stability starts to go away and you need to add stakes, guy lines, and other forms of tensioning in order to stabilize these large fabric panels so that they can handle some snow loading and some wind. So to combat the lack of structural stability caused by these large tension panels, what you can do is add additional struts and support mechanisms. We see this on tents like the Tarptent Notch and the Eon, which have a inverted V-shaped strut system built into the corners, and that helps tension some of these larger fabric panels. And the tent we're looking at today incorporates 2 carbon fiber struts in addition to your 2 trekking poles to create this structure and is capable of creating a highly tensioned tent in spite of its large fabric panels. So let's get right to it and take a look at the new Tarptent Dipole 1 and Dipole 2. The Tarptent Dipole 1 and 2 are both double pole, double vestibule, double door, side entry, single wall, Dyneema Composite Fabrics shelters. So the only difference between the two tents are that the Dipole 2 is a little bit taller than the Dipole 1, and of course it's wider and longer, so there's more interior volume for 2 persons to be comfortable inside. The unique features of the Dipole series are as follows. There's 4. The first one is that they can be staked with 4 stakes. They don't require apex guideline stakes in order to stay up and be stable. The Dipole 2 behind me is staked out with 4 stakes right now. We're in a light breeze. I would imagine that it's not going to have any problem at all with just 4 stakes. We're below the tree line in a forest, and it's nearly summertime here in Colorado, and it's going to be plenty stable enough with just those 4 stakes. That makes it very easy, quick, and simple to set up, and there's no apex skyline in your way when you're getting in and out of the tent, which is really nice. In addition, the design allows for both vestibule doors on both sides to be wide open. The vestibule doors are not part of the structural stability of the tent, and so you can have the vestibules open without an apex skyline, and your tent's going to stay up and be stable. The next feature I find unique, the end struts. These are 21-inch tall carbon fiber end struts, and they create an enormous amount of interior volume inside the tent. They vastly improve the livability of being inside the tent for very little extra weight and fabric that's required to create the additional surface area for these side panels that use the struts. Now, most tarp tent struts are not collapsible. These are 21-inch struts, collapsible down to 13 inches. They're shock corded, and they have grommet tips on them. So they look and behave just like a tent pole. You can remove them quite easily, or you can leave them in the tent and collapse them and roll the tent up around them. So they are a very user-friendly way to add a lot of interior volume to the tent. Finally, the dipoles have large, deep vestibules. So they can easily accommodate my expedition-sized backpack on both sides and provide a lot of livability options for those of you who are packing with a lot of gear. Okay, let's go ahead and take a tour of the Dipole 2 first, and then we'll take a look at the Dipole 1 in a little bit. Okay, as I mentioned before, this is set up with 2 trekking poles. So you can see one of the apex pole tips there and the other one over here. The other 2 pieces of structure in here are these carbon fiber struts. These are 21-inch long carbon struts. These are Easton 3.9 carbon poles, and they provide interior volume and some stability. And then another feature in here is that you can attach a guy line to these struts in really heavy weather. On each end of the tent, there is a mesh panel that is backed on the inside by a sill poly panel. That sill poly panel is a vent that can be open and closed, and we'll take a look at that when we go inside the tent. These tents are tensioned by only 4 stakes. They are staked in a rectangular pattern. So we're looking at one of the ends here, and you can see there's a stake down here and an adjustment point on the tent at the corner, and then a guy line running from the stake to the top of the strut. And then at the top of the strut, we have another adjustment mechanism, and we have the same thing on either side of the strut. So we have a guy line going from the strut to each stake, and from the stake back to the corner of the tent. And that is what gives the tent its ability to maintain structure with only 4 stakes. There are some mild catenary curves in these tents. You can see one here on the ridge line. You'll see them down here along the edges of the tent as well. There's a lot of argument in the community about whether or not catenary cut is appropriate for Dyneema Composite Fabrics. The rule is, as long as the line is bonded, it's fine. And these edges are indeed bonded, so that catenary cut can work the way it's supposed to work. Even though the tent only takes 4 guy lines to pitch in mild weather, you'll want to pack 4 additional stakes and 2 additional guy lines. The guy lines can be 3 feet or so long. And we're gonna put those guy lines on the end of the tent, and then 2 of the stakes are gonna be used to guy out the apex lines. And so let's go ahead and do that. So you can see that the apex guy lines effectively tighten that ridge line and provide a lot of stability to the pole if the tent is being buffeted in high winds. Without these apex guy lines, that pole has a whole range of motion it can go. And so the purpose of the guy line is to stabilize the location of your trekking poles. Then we'll add 1 guy line to each end of the tent. And so you can see that the end guy line effectively is going to pull tension on these ridge lines that connect the strut to the trekking pole apex. Okay, and that's going to give you a tent that's going to be very storm worthy in high winds. It will also help with snow loading because the fabric won't sag as much under a load when you have these extra 4 guy lines deployed. Now there are some additional guy line tie-out points at the vestibule doors. So you can optionally add guy lines there. They will serve a couple of purposes. They're not necessarily related to stormworthiness, but you can pull the vestibule out with a guy line and that will give you more space inside the vestibule. The other thing you can do with the guy line here is open one door or the other and keep the other one staked out. Now Tarptent has already supplied us with this guy line, and it exists on the end of the apex guy line that is supplied with the tent. So there's a clip here. We can clip that to one of the doors and then tighten that guy line, and you can see how it pulls the vestibule out. And it will add some stability, but not as much as the 2 end guy lines and 2 apex guy lines. And then if we want, we can leave that guy line there. Open one of the doors of the tent. And then we have another half of our vestibule remaining covered. You want to go inside, don't you? If you unzip and roll back one of the doors, then if you want to keep this from flapping in wind, you'll tighten that down a little bit. And then just remember that you won't be able to zip the door shut because you've changed the tension over here. So you'll have to loosen that up in order to close the door and then retighten. And you can do the same on the other side. And so if you noticed, I'm clipping one of these doors very specifically. It's the door that does not cover the interior door of the tent. So I can roll this one back, and then that gives me access to the large door here. So if I were to clip this door shut, then I'd be having to enter the tent through that door, which would be super inconvenient. Okay, let's go ahead and take a tour of the inside. When pitched and tightened, the Tarptent Dipole 2 is nearly 52 inches in width. That means it can accommodate not only me and a very large dog, but 2 wide sleeping pads. So I have 2 Nemo Tensor regular wide pads in here. They're 25 inches wide, and I still have space on either side of them. Now if we pan up to the head end of the tent, notice that the foot of the pads are down at they're pushed down at the end of the tent. But at the head end of the tent, I have a full 18 to 20 inches of space to store gear. And I love this because I like to keep all my gear in my tent, especially if I'm in areas that are frequented, campsites that are used heavily and frequented by rodents. I like to keep my gear inside my tent. So I have an expedition backpack here and some other stuff up here. Some of the other things I like to do inside the tent are lay out a map and plan the next day's trip, or if we're waiting out an afternoon rainstorm, being able to sit up with a couple people in here and play cards or whatever. While we're up here at this end, we'll take a look at this vent. So this vent slides on a draw cord. Now this draw cord is water absorbent and wicking. This will not be in the production model. This will be made of Dyneema Composite Fabrics. There's a toggle here, allows you to adjust the height of the vent. So you can leave it partially open, or you can take it all the way down. And now you have a window with a view, and you have this at both ends of the tent. So this is a great feature to allow for additional ventilation and views in the tent. So the vent material and the ends of the tent are made of sil poly. That way if your sleeping bag brushes against them, they're not going to be as condensation prone as the Dyneema Composite Fabrics. Now note the design of the vent here. We have the fly canopy overlapping the vent, and that will allow rain spray. If the vent is partially deployed, any rain spray will just drip down and out the vent. We have a couple more condensation drains built into the corners so that condensation running down the wall will drip onto these no-seam mesh panels and out the tent rather than down the sides. There's a couple of side pockets here that you can use to store gear. These will be a little bit larger on the production model as well. And a couple of mitten hooks at the apex that will allow you to put a clothesline or a line to hang a flashlight up. So as you can see, I am a good halfway down the end of the tent and sitting up, and my head is just touching. I'm not a tall person, I'm only 5'8", but the tent is claimed by Tarptent to be appropriate for people up to 6 feet 10 inches. I have no reason not to believe that. This is one of the largest trekking pole tents I've been in that also has usable headroom in it. So again, very spacious in here. It feels like a true palace for 1 or 2 people. And remember, the heights of these end struts are 21 inches. So even at the very end of the tent, if you're laying down with your head at the edge of the tent, you have enough space so that your head is not brushing into the tent canopy. Now for the interior of the Dipole 1, we have a large interior volume as well. And again, we're enjoying the same 21-inch struts that are on the Dipole 2 to create a very livable interior volume. I've used the notch lithium for many years now, and it is tiny compared to the interior volume that is in the Dipole 1. So again, I have my regular length, 72-inch long by wide width, 25-inch wide pad in here. And you can see here down at the end. So if you look down at this end of the tent, you can see my wide pad in there. And I still have lots of room on either side of the pad. The width of the tent across the entire length is about 36 inches when everything is tight, nice and tight. And so you have a lot of room in here for extra gear if you need to on the sides. And again, with the Dipole 1, we have end vents that open and close via a draw cord. A silk poly end wall for weather protection. We've got the condensation drains on both sides at both ends of the tent. And then up here at the head end, just like with the Dipole 2, I have plenty of space to fit an expedition-sized backpack up here or a little office area for doing mapping for the next leg of my trip. Okay, a few other features that are worth pointing out. The vents can be opened fully in an overhead rain. It's raining right now, and rain's not going to go in the tent unless it's really hard. And the reason for that is because the carbon fiber struts can be set inward a little bit, which gives a bit of a canopy and some protection for that vent. All right, it's raining, so we're inside the tent now. Thunder's booming outside, so hopefully we can wrap this up before it gets too noisy. Let's go through a few more notes on this series of shelters. First and most important, let's talk about the weights. The Dipole 1 is 22.3 ounces without tent stakes or stuff sacks. I generally think that's the fairest way to compare tents. I know some tents require more stakes than others, but as a user, you have the option to choose what stakes you want to take with your tent. Now, the Dipole 1 and Dipole 2 benefit from fairly tight tension, and I would not rely on skewer stakes in anything except for the hardest soils. For example, soils you might find in some alpine tundra areas. Each tent ships with 6-inch Easton tubular aluminum stakes. I would opt for the 8-inch Easton tubular aluminum stakes if you were pitching this tent in a pine forest like I am here now, because there's quite a lot of duff on the forest floor, and a 6-inch stake just doesn't quite hold it here. And then for apex and strut guylines, I think you can get away with a lighter stake for sure. The peak heights of these tents are a little bit different. The Dipole 1 is 43 inches and the Dipole 2 is about 45 inches. Now I like angling like I've done here, my pole from the apex down at an angle, and that gives me access to the entire door without a pole going down straight up and down in the middle of the door. So if you're going to do that, your poles need to be obviously a little bit longer than 43 or 45 inches. Just to summarize how to deal with high winds, you're going to use the 4 corner stakes, of course. You're also going to use the apex guylines and stake those out, so that adds 2 additional stakeout points. And I recommend adding a 3-foot or 4-foot guyline to each of the end struts, and that requires 2 additional stakes. And this gives you enough stakes to bring out all the seam lines in strong tension, and that will give you the best wind stability and snow loading performance. In terms of the order of how to set up the tent, you're going to stake out one end first. That includes installing the strut if it's not already installed, staking out those 2 end corners, and then making sure that the seam edge from the strut to each corner is tight. Then you're going to pull the tent tight and do the exact same thing at the opposite end. Once you have this dialed in, then you can unzip the door from the top, because there's a 2-way zipper there, insert your trekking pole, make sure it's the right length, and pop your trekking pole in on either side. Then you can go around and adjust the corner stake locations if you need to. Ideally, you want the guy line from the corner of the tent out to that stake to be parallel to the corner seam of the tent, so 45 degrees off the corner of the tent, or a little bit to the outside. That will help keep the seam edges, or excuse me, the fly edges tighter if it's just angled a little bit to the outside. And then once your stake locations are set, then you can adjust your corner guy line tension. That brings your poles and ridge line into tension. And then finally you can go to the end struts and adjust the guy line tension for the guy lines that go from the strut down to the stakes. And as with any kind of pyramid or pseudo pyramid structure like this, you are dealing with an iterative process to get it dialed in aesthetically, and just to make sure all the lines look good and tension is distributed evenly through the tent. Now this is a pre-production model, so there's going to be some changes. I showed you the draw cord used for the vents. There's a wicking material in there now that's going to be changed to non-wicking DCF for the production model. Some other things they're going to change for production is to make these pole reinforcement caps a little bit bigger, and that's going to help distribute load and minimize the risk of poking through the cap with your trekking pole tip. And maybe it'll allow us to use the grip end of our pole up in the pole cap if we want that instead. Now the tent pitches a little bit tighter and more stable with the tip end of the pole cap, but when I'm using trekking poles like my Black Diamond distance carbon running poles, they have plastic pole cap tips on them and they don't fit into the grommets, and so I'd rather pitch the tent with the grips up when I'm using those poles. And a bigger pole cap reinforcement area would be nice. The interior pockets as they stand are pretty good sized already, but they're going to be a little bit bigger, and that's kind of nice if you want to store like wet socks or gloves or just more gear in those side pockets. Since those are the only means of storage in this tent, that'd be a nice upgrade. Okay, let's talk about fabrics. As I mentioned, the tent uses no-seam mesh and sil poly. The DCF used in the canopy is CT1E.08. That is a 0.5 to 0.55 ounce per square yard. It's very commonly used in Dyneema tents. It is used in the Z-Packs tents, although Z-Packs also offers options. I know at least for the duplex, for a slightly heavier version, that's around 0.75 ounces per square yard for some of their colors. The floor is the same floor that's used in other Tarptent lithium series tents, and that's CT2K.18. And this is a durable, highly waterproof 1 ounce per square yard fabric. You can see the end vent cover, the sil poly end vent cover doing its job here. You can see it's getting wet on the other side from rain hitting the no-seam mesh and sliding down because we have this little bit of a fly overhang over the top edge of the vent, and everything is working exactly how it's supposed to. And again, you know, you can undo these vents even when it's raining, and you're not going to get super wet inside. In fact, you shouldn't get wet at all unless it's a really heavy rain that is, you know, bouncing up and into the tent. or a driving sideways rain that is coming into the no-seam mesh. We can look at the other end vent here, which has been open the entire time I've been doing this video inside the tent while it's been raining, and water has not gotten onto the floor. There's a little bit, as you can see, that bounced through the mesh there that got onto the inside, but that's not really going anywhere. That's not enough to worry about. For those of you who are not familiar with Dyneema Composite Fabrics, it is a little bit different than your traditional woven sil nylon or sil poly. So the way Dyneema Composite Fabrics work is you have these strands or filaments of ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, which is an incredibly strong fiber. And you'll hear it thrown around that for its weight, it's stronger than steel. So these strands are overlaid in a crisscross pattern, in a grid. And then that grid is rolled through a press that creates a mylar film on the top and bottom sides of the strands, effectively sandwiching this Dyneema fiber grid in between two mylar films. And that's how we get these fabrics that are used in these tents. And the result is a fabric that is very light, it's very strong, it's highly UV resistant, and it's very, very stretch resistant. So that means when it gets cold or wet, DCF doesn't sag in the same way that, for example, sil nylon does. In addition, DCF tends to absorb very little water, so it's easy to shake out, and you're not carrying a lot of water weight if your tent gets soaked. For its weight, DCF has a very high tensile strength, which means you can place an enormous load across a fabric panel to keep it in tension, which keeps it from flapping, which makes for a very stable structure. It has excellent tear strength, so the chance that it's going to tear under a tensile load is very, very low. If you combine that with its UV resistance, you know that a nylon tent that's been exposed to the sun for many, many days loses its tensile and tear strength significantly, and DCF maintains it much, much better. DCF is not without its woes. It needs to be taken care of. It's very poorly abrasion resistant, puncture resistant. Fortunately, it's easy to repair. So I know people get bent out of shape about tents that use DCF floors versus nylon or poly floors, but the reality is they're so easy to repair with repair tapes like Tyvek and gear aid tapes and things like that, that it's just almost a non-issue. But it does mean that you need to care for your tent if you're camping in extremely brushy areas, so you don't want deadfall poking the canopy of the tent, because obviously a hole in the canopy is far more problematic than a hole in the floor. One of the other weaknesses of Dyneema is that if you crinkle it and stuff it over and over again, you're going to weaken that mylar film, and it causes pinholes or micro tears in the mylar film. And so you should always fold and roll a Dyneema tent. Never try to stuff it into your pack or a stuff sack. Finally, Dyneema is subject to long-term wear that can range from those pinhole effects that I mentioned with rolling or stuffing a tent, and then you can get physical defects related to what's called mylar creep, which means if you tension a mylar panel too tight, it will stretch and not rebound, and so the result is a thinning of the mylar coating, and that can result in holes or weakness in the mylar tent. The way around this is to manufacture your Dyneema tents so that any guyline or stakeout point, any point where you're pulling tension on a panel, that line of tension should be going on a seam and not through the middle of a panel. And so you see sometimes mid-panel tie-out points that are at the bottom edge in the middle of a panel, and there's no seam there to protect the film. And so if you pull on that seam too tight, you will get creeping of the mylar, and then this isn't going to happen over the short term. This is going to happen over the lifetime of your tent, and it will create weakness in the panel. And you'll notice this as your tent ages, as you use it more, because it'll develop unusual wrinkles in the panel that you were like, oh, that wasn't there before, I wonder why that's there. And that's often the reason why. Tarp tent doesn't do that with any of their end panels, so there's no temptation to put a stake in where you shouldn't. I know some people have put additional tie-out points on the mid middle edge of the notch vestibule, the tarp tent notch vestibule. There's no seam there from the edge to the apex. And so to me, that's a poor place to place a lot of tension. Now that doesn't mean you can't put a stake there and put a little bit of tension on it, and you can add stake out points. Just keep that in mind. These are known failure mechanisms of DCF, and in a tent like this, it's just not needed. There's plenty of strong seams that can carry the tension of a panel. Now we spent some time talking about a comparison of the Dipole, especially the Dipole 2, to other DCF tents on the market that you might be interested in. This includes the Durston Gear X-Mid Pro, the Z-Pax Duplex, the Gossamer Gear DCF the 2. Those are the three that come to mind right away. Well, there might be some more that Andrew throws in his review for comparison. But I'm not going to go into the detailed comparison of those tents here in the video, but we do address that in the review. So again, be sure to click the link in the video description below, and that will take you to information about where this tent, where the Dipole fits into the broader market of ultralight trekking pole supported DCF tents. We're going to talk a little bit about the tarp tent patent for this tent and what that patent covers, and emphasize again the unique features of the Dipole series of tents that are not found on any other tent on the market, or at least not executed to the extent that they are with the Dipole. Okay, after spending some time with the tarp tent Dipole tents, I have some final first impressions, but final thoughts for this video. And my initial takeaways are that these are the roomiest tents I've used at this weight. The combination of a decent apex pole height combined with 21-inch end struts that really do not interfere with but add tremendous value to both of these tents creates this interior livable volume that is unique and rare among trekking pole supported tents. And it's almost like being in something like a Nemo Dagger, which has crisscrossing curved poles, but much, much lighter, obviously. So that to me is the most striking thing about these tents, and probably my favorite feature. The other thing I really like is the 4-stake setup. It really does not require more than 4 stakes in order to have a livable shelter that can deal with rain and light winds. I deal with heavy rain and heavy winds frequently throughout all 3 seasons in which I might use a single wall shelter like this. And I have the option for adding the 2 apex guylines and the 2 end guylines, and providing additional volume to the vestibules and tension on the vestibule walls by staking them out to the apex skyline stake. So again, those are huge benefits if you are looking to ensure that your tent is stormworthy. The challenges I faced in using this tent was learning the setup and the geometry, and I think this is true with any pyramid tent, and it's not unique to the Dipole series. It's one of those fun things to try to figure out with trekking pole supported shelters, is how do they work, where do the lines of tension go, and what's the best way to set it up so that you can get the most performance in a storm out of one of these shelters. It's a fun puzzle, and the Dipole fully allows you to accomplish those objectives. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this review of the Tarptent Dipole 1 and Tarptent Dipole 2. These are Dyneema Composite Fabric trekking pole supported tents. For more information about these tents, make sure you see the review at the link in the description below the video, and that'll take you to our written review at backpackinglight.com, where you can see a bunch more pictures and lots more information about these 2 new shelters.